It's bullshit. I want to say that up front. It is bullshit the way that lore is demonized now. Well, not demonized, but the way. I should probably back up before I get into this, but a couple days ago when my internet was going on and off, and then but before it went off completely for almost a whole day, Lethal Lightning was doing a video responding to an article talking about how lore is unimportant. That's the opposite. And I'm going to say this claim is not only vacuous, but it is a bullshit narrative that the media is trying to push. It is so vacuous, it makes autism look good by comparison. And I say that as an autist. I had no idea where I was going with that, but yeah, these journalists and people who are saying lore is unimportant, you make autists like me look like Einstein sometimes. And that is infuriating. Like, I miss the days when autism was stigmatized, kinda. Well, it kinda is still, but that's unimportant. The point is, lore is important. It is important for world building, for building the story, because you have to have at least bits and information of the world in the story that's not the real world for you to say stuff about what's going on. That's why it's important in Star Wars and Game of Thrones and Lord of the Rings. Hell, Tolkien, I think, epitomized this. Or at the very least, I don't even know how to describe it. Like, I don't think he was the first person to do it. I think Lovecraft and maybe some other people might have beaten him to it to a small extent. But Tolkien, he refined lore building. Or lore. And I don't think he did this intentionally. This was, like, the Lord of the Rings for him was just a means of amusement for him, his children, and his friends. That was it. But because he weaved such a rich narrative of lore, that after he died, his son was able to make a book out of it. The Silmarillion. And through that, other stories Tolkien was able to make in his lifetime with this lore in mind. Beren and Luthien, the Silmarillion, the Hobbit, the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Like, I don't know all the Lord of the Rings stories, so I'm going off the ones I know off the top of my head, but with lore, you can build upon what you've already done. So, let's say we do with what Star Wars did. They had the original trilogy. I don't think there was a lot of lore involved. It was just good guys versus bad guys. An evil empire versus a good rebellion. That was it. Then they expanded upon it over the years as time went on. And with that lore, they were able to make games for other characters not related to the main cast. They were able to make comics, all sorts of good shit. Like, I miss the 90s when that lore stuff was at its apex. Actually, it was also at its apex in the early 2000s because they had some good shit, especially around the Fets. But I'm getting off topic. And lore is one of the reasons I constantly come back to Star Wars now. Like, I loved reading about it on the Wikipedia when I was in, I think, high school. Like, I read it a little bit, not a whole lot, but I read some of it. And then I came back to it around the same time the sequel trilogy was starting. Then I came back to it again after I realized that Disney had botched the sequel trilogy. And I just looked at it like, there was a rich narrative that Disney could have used in here. There was so much they could have adapted into movies that wasn't involving the main cast. You didn't need the main cast from the original trilogy to come back here. And you could have done, like, I would have done a trilogy around Jango Fett, just adapt Open Seasons and Bounty Hunter, and you have a trilogy right there. And you'd have an active fan base that would go see it. Anyway, back on topic. Lore is the building block for the story. You need it, and you need to be consistent with it. The only people who say this is unimportant are either intellectually or creatively bankrupt, impotent, or, I don't know, invalids, or incompetent. I might have been using that word twice, but yeah, creatively impotent would be the word I would use. And impotent in their own confidence in what they've done. Like, people who say lore is unimportant show they know jack shit about what it means to make a story, a good story. Because lore is a fascinating thing to look at. It's one of the reasons I like the Mandalorians so much. Not the show, the actual group of people in the Star Wars EU. Their lore is rich, interesting, and there was room to add on to it. The same can be said for any lore. You could do that with Lord of the Rings. They technically tried that with the Shadow of Mordor series, but that raped the lore of that Tolkien created a little bit. Like, they made Celebrimbor a smith, a warrior. Makes no sense why he would know how to do that. Also, they may have plagiarized some stuff from Assassin's Creed 2. But again, I'm getting off topic. There's room within the lore of a mythos for you to build a more content to make money off of. And that's the infuriating thing. That's what infuriates me the most about people who attack lore now. And is that they are creatively stupid. They do not see the merits of it. They do not see how it is useful. Like, these are Bob Iger people. These are like Bob Iger. They have no creativity. They're no different than the people who run these studios and companies. Creatively, they are brain dead. Which is kind of sad, really. There was a time when someone was brain dead, you pulled the plug. And especially, I think this also just shows how bankrupt morally and creatively the people doing stories now are. And the journalists defending them, they have no leg to stand on morally or creatively. So they attack people who like this stuff. They act like it's unimportant. It is important. Again, the Lord of the Rings lore and the Star Wars lore of the expanded universe that was built around it after the original trilogy was rich with content you could have used to make money. But Disney, being Disney with Star Wars, decided, fuck that, it's going in the harbor. They threw it away. They cast it aside. Like a redhead stepchild. Which is kind of a shame, but anyway. And like I said, it's rich, and you can make more stories in that lore. Like with Star Wars, for an example, with the EU, they built their lore in comics, in video games, in books, and novels. And there was some consistency in what they did. I don't know for sure how consistent they were, but there was some consistency. Until the prequels came out, then the consistency was challenged a little because... Like, for one thing, if back when Star Wars was starting out, you could never touch on the Clone Wars. It was just something referenced in the first movie, in A New Hope, and then they weren't allowed to touch on that, so they had to be creative in how they referenced it. So there was room for error, but hey, that's just how it works. You have constraints. You have limits to what you are able to do. And the other argument is that lore can be inconsistent is bullshit of an excuse, because it doesn't matter if it's inconsistent. I say the same thing about the Disney Star Wars lore. You don't see people raking them over the coals. Oh, wait, that's right, because most journalists are hacks bought off by these companies, so they have no reason to bitch. And that's all I can really say, other than, yeah, this whole narrative that lore is bullshit is itself bullshit. It's vacuous. It's stupid. It's moronic. Like, this is James Gunn levels of moronic. And that's pretty hard to do, because James Gunn is a fucking moron. Like, creatively, when it comes to making movies, he's good in the business. As a person, he's a bit like Stephen King. He makes good products, but anywhere else, he's brain dead. Same with George R.R. Martin. Actually, he's the worst of the bunch. But that's getting off topic. Again, my point is, lore, it is important. It is fascinating to read lore. To see how a world got to the point it is. How a society rose up and fell or became decadent and declined. And it takes inspiration, and it can take inspiration from anywhere. It can be made up out of nowhere, or it can take inspiration from real world history. And it can, again, come from anywhere. It can be built up to just lead up to the main event of the story. And you don't have to be in-depth with it. You can just be vague with the lore sometimes. Like, that's something they did with the original Star Wars trilogy, was they were vague about previous events. It wasn't until they did the EU that they expanded upon it. And then with the prequels, they expanded on it more, and then the Star Wars fans got all uppity and a little entitled, to be quite perfectly honest. And now the assholes of the hour, Disney owned Star Wars. Congratulations, dumbasses. The evil empire now owns your favorite product. And again, I'm going off topic. And it's not just Lord of the Rings and Star Wars. I mean, there's lore in video games, in movies before, outside of those two that I like to mention, and there's lore even in the pulps to some extent. Like, Conan was like a refined version of Kull, who was like his ancestor. And you had all sorts of stuff. You had the lore in the pulp stuff. You had sometimes I don't even think they were thinking much in the lore with those, but that's just my personal opinion. You have lore in historical fiction and all sorts of stuff. And the fact that people get on a high horse and complain that lore is not important just shows how asinine they really are and how out of touch they are. When people complain, you're not being consistent with the lore. Yeah, you should be consistent with the lore because the lore was built around the world you technically tell a story in, so you have to be consistent with it. There's only two kinds of people who I think, well, there's two other kinds of people who I think have a problem with lore. It's either people who don't like working in an IP with the information, or people who are just lazy. And as a lazy man, I can tell you that's no way to live as a writer. That's kind of a pathetic way to live, being lazy constantly. Why do you think Star Wars took such a swan dive? Because of laziness. And decadence and ego and a bunch of other stuff that probably isn't worth getting into. But there was lore, and people have either cast it aside or prefer to ignore it. Oh, there's another kind of person who has a problem with lore. Bootlickers. You know, like journalists. Who personally are human garbage. They serve no purpose in society. And the fact that they're on their high horse defending Disney and Amazon about stuff kind of just pisses me off. It kind of shows that they have lost their way. They have no... Like, they're disingenuous is the main problem. And I've said all I can say about lore without rambling, but... Yeah, lore is just... It's lore. It's good for world building. A lot of fantasy writers used to do it before they became hacks or assholes. And with that, have a nice day, and remember the game was rigged from the start. Yeah, if that wasn't apparent before, it is now.